Do you think Vikings were just tough warriors who ignored the cold? In the movies, we see them charging through the snow in leather vests and fur capes, seemingly unbothered by the frost. But the reality? The reality would kill a modern human in days. Imagine a world where the sun vanishes for 20 hours a day, where the air is so cold it cracks timber, and the wind feels like 1,000 ice-cold needles against your skin. Viking settlements weren't just villages, they were laboratories of survival. Today, we aren't just looking at history, we are uncovering the forgotten thermal engineering that allowed a civilization to thrive in an ice kingdom without a single watt of electricity. From biological furnaces to room-within-a-room architecture, these are the 10 ingenious ways Vikings stayed warm in deadly winters. The battle against the cold isn't won by generating heat, it's won by refusing to lose it. Vikings were masters of natural materials. While we think of fur, the true hero of the North was wool, but not just any wool. The Vikings used wool from local sheep that retained its natural lanolin. This waxy, oily coating made the garments naturally water-resistant. Even when it was soaking wet, this wool continued to insulate. A typical Viking didn't just throw on a coat, they wore a system of 7 to 8 layers. The base layer, always linen, it wicked away sweat. If you sweat and that moisture stays on your skin in minus 20 degrees, you're dead. The mid-layers, tunics as thick as your thumb, layered one over the other to create air pockets. The trousers, loose, not tight. Why? Because trapped air is the best insulator on the planet. The cloak, a massive 20-pound sheet of wool. If you were wealthy, you lined it with fur. But here's the secret. They wore the fur on the inside. Putting fur on the outside is for show. Putting it against your body is for survival. Viking longhouses were not primitive huts. They were sophisticated thermal systems. These structures could be up to 200 feet long, but were deliberately kept narrow. Why? Because a narrow space is easier to heat. The walls were nearly a meter thick, made of vertical timber and daub, a mix of clay, straw, and animal dung. In places like Iceland, they used turf. These walls were basically ancient insulation panels, trapping millions of microscopic air bubbles. But the real genius was in the roof. There were no chimneys. Instead, there was a small smoke hole. The heat from the central fire would rise, hit the underside of the thick thatch roof, and linger there. This turned the entire roof into a radiant heat panel, warming the house from the top down. Inside, the floor was packed earth, covered in a foot of fresh straw. Because cold air sinks, the Vikings built raised sleeping platforms. They slept a meter off the ground, literally staying above the freeze zone of the floor. At the exact center of every longhouse sat the hearth. This wasn't just a fireplace, it was the spiritual and physical heart of the home. They used soapstone to line the fire pits. Soapstone is a thermal battery. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it over hours. Even after the flames died down at 2 a.m., those stones would still be radiating warmth into the room. The fire was never allowed to go out. From autumn to spring, someone was always on fire watch. To let the hearth die was considered a curse, and practically speaking, it was. Without that central 18-degree core, the longhouse would quickly become a tomb. What did they do when they had to leave the fire? They took the heat with them. Vikings would select smooth river stones, avoiding any with cracks, as those could explode in the fire, and bury them in the coals. Once these stones were glowing, they'd wrap them in thick wool or sheepskin. A single 3-kilogram stone could hold usable heat for 8 hours. Bed warming. They would tuck these stones under the furs an hour before sleep. Foot warmers. They built wooden boxes with air holes, placed a hot stone inside, and rested their feet on them while working. It's a low-tech solution that modern survivalists still use today because, quite simply, it works. In a Viking winter, privacy was a luxury that could cost you your life. Everyone slept together. Parents, children, servants, and guests would pile into a massive bed, often 3 meters wide. Think about the math. A resting human body produces about 100 watts of heat. Put 8 people in a bed, and you have an 800-watt space heater running all night. They had a system. Children in the middle, the warmest spot. The elderly next to them. Strong young adults on the edges to act as thermal barriers. They'd pull heavy wool curtains shut around the bed, creating a micro room that stayed 20 degrees warmer than the rest of the house. The Viking diet was a high-octane fuel. You can't stay warm on a salad. In winter, they consumed staggering amounts of animal fat. Lard, tallow, and butter were eaten by the spoonful. Fat has twice the calories of protein or carbs. They ate fatty porridge, grains cooked in whole cream and topped with butter and bacon. They drank heated ale and herbal teas. A working Viking man in winter would consume 5,000 calories a day. Every meal was designed to stoke the internal furnace. If the furnace runs low on fuel, the body shuts down. The Vikings were surprisingly clean, but their bathhouses were actually medical facilities. They would superheat stones, pour water over them to create steam, and sit in 50-degree heat, 122 degrees Fahrenheit. This wasn't just for comfort. The heat forced the blood vessels to dilate, improving circulation to the fingers and toes, the areas most prone to frostbite. They would then run out and roll in the snow. This contrast therapy toughened the immune system and is the direct ancestor of the modern Scandinavian sauna culture. Inactivity was a death sentence. To stay warm, you had to move. Viking mornings started with ritualistic movement, squats, lunges, and brisk walking, just to get the blood pumping. Throughout the day, every chore was an exercise. Chopping wood, clearing snow, and combat training weren't just work. They were ways to generate kinetic heat. Even in the evenings, they didn't just sit. They danced, clapped, and wrestled. They knew that a moving body is a warm body. This is the one that shocks modern sensibilities. The Vikings lived with their livestock. One end of the longhouse was often a stable. The power of the cow. A single cow produces about 1,000 watts of heat. The barn heater. If you have 6 cows, 10 sheep, and a few goats, you are living next to a 6,000-watt biological heater that never turns off. The heat from the animals would rise, travel along the roof beams, and mix with the heat from the human hearth. Plus, the fermenting manure and straw in the stalls generated even more heat through decomposition. It wasn't the cleanest system, but it was one of the most effective.
Finally, they didn't let the snow trap them. They used it. Viking skis were hand-carved, often asymmetric, one long for gliding, one short with fur for grip. Skiing allowed them to hunt elk and reindeer that were struggling in the deep powder. But more importantly, a 30-minute vigorous ski session would make a Viking break a sweat in sub-zero temperatures. It was their way of resetting their body temperature before heading back into the longhouse. The Vikings weren't primitive. They were sophisticated engineers of thermodynamics. They didn't rely on one big heater. They relied on a system of small solutions: layered wool, turf walls, soapstone batteries, biological furnaces. They proved that with enough ingenuity, humans can thrive in conditions we consider impossible. The next time you feel a chill, remember the Vikings. They didn't just survive the winter, they owned it.